What we know about Fred Rogers is that he was born in Pennsylvania, around Pittsburgh, that he was a sickly child. He had asthma, and he caught every disease that came through, including scarlet fever, and he spent a whole lot of time in bed because of that. And so that started this great fantasy life that he had. He said he would stay in bed and put his knees up underneath the covers, and suddenly those would become the mountains, and the valleys would be down on either side. And his parents were very well off. They were Republicans, they were Presbyterians, and they wanted to make sure that their son had the best of everything that they could give him. And going to church, he learned about Daniel and the lion's den. And so what his little head did is he made Daniel the lion kind of his alter ego. And so if you watch any Mr. Rogers, you'll know that Daniel the lion was his friend that was always the one that talked about all kinds of feelings and everything. And so it's straight biblical reference then. The story of Daniel and the lion is Daniel himself was one of the smarter young people, and he got picked up by the Babylon captivity, and he was taken away from Jerusalem, and he was told he needed to pledge allegiance to the Babylonians, and he said, no, I'm not going to. I'm only going to pledge allegiance to my God. And so he gets thrown into the lion's den, and they said, if your God is so good, you will live through this. And so they put him in there, and the next day they went and looked and didn't expect Daniel to be alive, and lo and behold, he was. And so that's where Daniel the lion came from. So Daniel the lion is very brave and holds all of the feelings. So through all of the Mr. Rogers episodes, Daniel is the truth teller that is there. So what was interesting is that Fred Rogers started playing the piano at age 5, and he actually got his degree in music. And so music came out, and he loved to play the piano at the same time that television came out. So it was a brand new medium, and he said, hey, I think this is pretty cool. And his parents had said, but we really want you to go be a pastor. You've talked to us about that. And he said, well, I will do that, but I think first I want to go to New York and see what I can do with this television stuff. Well, when we read Romans today, or when Elizabeth read Romans today, it talks about different people having different talents. And when Fred Rogers was in undergrad, he knew he was going to seminary, so he was taking a lot of development courses, child development courses, and how people learn and all of that kind of stuff, and talk about unique gifts all being at the same place at the same time. He just happened to have, at the time he was going through early childhood development, people on staff such as Dr. Spock, you heard of him? T. Barry Brazelton, another pediatrician, heard of him? Eric Erickson, renowned child psychologist. These were the teachers that he was with. And they were doing this deep down study on children and how they learned, and that figuring out that they're not really just little adults, that they are unique individuals, and so much of what we know about the way that children perceive things and see things all came out of these studies that were happening. And so he goes to New York, and he sees that they're doing this, quote, children's television, and he said it was horrible. It was slapstick comedy where they would hit one and the other would bounce up and they'd hit another. And he said it was just, he goes, it just made me sad inside. So I came back to Pittsburgh and decided I was going to go to seminary. And so I went to seminary, and then I went up. This was when the very first education TV started. And he said, I want to do a thing called Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And it was based on some of the stuff that was being done in New York. And they said, okay. So he gets out of seminary, and he becomes the first Presbyterian TV evangelist that they had. And the Presbyterian Church didn't really know what to do with this, because television was a whole new medium, and they didn't know about TV evangelists. But he goes and he does that. And so when you look at the Mr. Rogers show, it begins with 4 things. And the first one is the theme song that we started with. And so what does our worship service start with? It starts with the music, doesn't it? All right. What is another thing that you know that Mr. Rogers starts with? Okay, he changes his jacket, and he does the other one too, but he changes his jacket. And so what that was is that's supposed to filter in with the word, because what the word does is it comforts us. It surrounds us. And so he puts this sweater on, and it's the comforting part of the word. Then he changes his shoes, and what shoes do is they protect us. And so what we do in our worship service before we leave, we bring everything up with our closing song, and it sends us out in protection. And then there's one more thing he does. And it was something I didn't realize until I went back to watch him. Every single show, he goes over and he feeds the fish. All right? And so what do we know about fish and being fed? Yeah, we've got Sermon on the Mount. We've got the fish at when one of Jesus's, when he comes back after he's dead and he feeds the people, the disciples, the fish. So all of this beautiful imagery that he's teaching these kids about church, and they don't even realize that they're learning that. So in that first little bit, he's got a whole worship service sitting right there giving it to them. Oh, it gives me chills just thinking about it. This stuff really excites me here. All right, so so when all of this is starting, and they're still learning out how kids think and everything, so he goes to Boston, and they have a Mr. Rogers Day. And this little boy comes up to him, and he says, "Mr. Rogers, I have a question." And he goes, "Well, what's your name?" He said, "My name's Thatcher." And he goes, "Thatcher, what's your question?" And he said, "How did you get out of the TV?" Now think about it. Kids are really concrete. And he goes, "Well, the TV is just," and he explains a little bit about the TV just being a box and everything. But that's one thing that we need to remember, especially when we're talking to children that are less than 12 years old, is that they're very concrete thinkers. The other night, Danny's my husband, Danny and I got off an airplane, and this plane came in, and the plane, it wasn't the one we were leaving on, but it was apparent that that plane had been delayed quite a while. And the people that were getting off, it was at night, and they were kind of tired and haggard, and this mom had this little boy that was about 6, and she goes, "Ah, we're home." And he looks at her, and he goes, "We're not home." Like he expected the plane to fly, I guess, down his street and drop him off right in front of his house. And so what Fred Rogers really wanted to show is that children are so special, but they don't think like adults do. They think with their feelings, they think with concreteness. And so this is something in the church and in our daily lives that we really can learn about. And there's parts of us as adults that can go back into that childhood time really easy and get that. So he said what always amazed him was when he could walk into a preschool class and he could sit down not knowing any of them. And he would just sit there quietly and wait till they came up to him. And inevitably one would come up and have these real important conversations. Like he said he walked in one and there were about 40 kids that were there, and one little boy walked up and he goes, "My stuffed animal lost his ear in the washing machine." And Mr. Rogers said, "That must have been hard." He said, "But we don't lose our ears in washing machines, do we?" And the little boy said, "No, we don't." And so Mr. Rogers said, well, what I needed to affirm him was that, yes, stuffed animals can lose their ears that way, but adults aren't going to. And so to be able to talk to children and get where they are and meet them. And so that's what he tried to do, just like Jesus did, is Jesus tried to figure out where people were. Like just last week, we were talking about Jesus walking across the water, meeting people on a stormy sea right where they were. And that's what Mr. Rogers tried to do with what he did, was meet the people where they were. Mr. Rogers said that love is at the root of everything. Have you ever heard that before? Ever read that any place in the Bible, that love is the most important thing and that all God wants is a relationship with us? Yeah, that's one thing that Fred Rogers tried to get out there. And he called it Mr. Rogers' neighborhood because neighborhoods are made up of diverse people. And so he tried every week in his neighborhood to have diversity come in, knowing that with that diversity there was going to be conflict, because if you have 2 or more people in a room, you're going to have 2 or more belief systems in that room, which means there's going to be some conversation. Billy Graham's wife said, anytime you have 2 or more people in the same room, there needs to be a conversation. Because if both agreed on everything, you'd only need to have one person. But we become better people when we listen to what the other person has to say. And so this is what Mr. Rogers tried to do in everything he did, was bring in diverse people. So he introduced, his spirituality was to be inclusive, and his theology was to write out of today's lesson, love your neighbor as you love yourself. It's that easy. That's what it boils down to. And if anybody would ask me, what do the Presbyterians and Lutherans hold in common, I would say, you need to love your neighbor and love yourself. That's the basis of where we are. So there were several people that came in to the neighborhood. And his very first week, anybody want to guess what he hit the very first week? It was the 1960s. What? The postman was a little bit later. The very first one, he hits the Vietnam War. So how do you discuss that with a bunch of children? Well, what he did is he had King Friday the 13th come up and decide that he was fearful and that he was going to build a wall all around the castle because people were trying to change things and he didn't like it. And so he was going to build this wall, and in doing that, everybody inside that wall had to believe the way he did. And that left out a lot of his friends. And so what his friends did is that they got balloons, and they put love and they put peace on the balloons, and they flew them up and over the wall, and he wanted them shot down before he read them because they were changing his world. And somebody said, no, read what it says. It says peace and love. It said they want peace and love. And so that's what he tried to tell people, is that putting boundaries up like walls isn't going to solve the problem. It's just going to make our world smaller. But the balloons of peace and love. Now, this is back in the 1960s. He's sharing this with children, peace and love. He goes on to tell people that the number one problem that children have, and I think adults do too, is that we're scared. We don't want to be vulnerable, and that causes anxiety in our lives. I don't know about you, but I can attest that when I get scared, I get anxious, and I don't want to be vulnerable. And so then put this magic, armor on and go out into the world. And in my life coaching practice, I cannot tell you how many people I worked with that said we have to put our armor on before you go into that job interview. We have to put that armor on before you go home to Thanksgiving to see that relative that you don't always get along with. Yes, that there are times for our own sakes we have to put armor on. But in the ideal neighborhood, we all listen and communicate. And that's what Mr. Rogers did his best to do. Okay, June 7th, 1968. That name mean anything? That date mean anything? Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. And all over television there was this new word, assassination, assassination, assassination. Fred Rogers got on television and he said, "Have you heard this word, assassination?" And they talked about assassination was when someone is killed in a surprising way. What a great way to define that. Nothing violent about it. I mean, there is an assassination, but in explaining it, it's when someone's killed in a surprising way. And he goes on to talk about the grief that comes with that. You see, he didn't let anything be off balance or that you didn't talk about in the neighborhood. So he talked about the grief that went with that. Another thing that he brought to television that was so against what children's programming was the slowness of it. Again, another thing that's used in ministry. What did we do the very first thing? We took a moment and calmed ourselves at the beginning of worship to get ready to go in and pray. And we took another moment when we got to confession to take a moment and pray. He actually took an egg timer, set it for a minute, set it down, and they sat there for a minute on television in silence. Yeah, you thought I was going to go a minute, didn't you? Then he got this great turtle, and he put the turtle down. And he said, "Just watch this turtle." And, turtles don't move real fast. But it was fascinating to all of the kids. And the people that were working there were going, "Wow, I've never really sat and watched a turtle move like that." What we miss by not taking silence and doing that. Again, something he was taught in seminary. Be quiet. Take the quiet times and learn. Now, 143, the numbers 143, were real important to Fred Rogers. He said it's because that's how much he weighed through all of his life, because he was a very avid swimmer. But then he shared that 143 in his world means I love you, because I is 1, love is 4, L-O-V-E, U is 3, Y-O-U. So he would say 143, 143, 143. So it's just, some people do what is the love sign? Yeah. Anyway, that's hook 'em horns, isn't it? Yeah. All right. They would do the love sign, but he would say 143. So I don't know. I encourage you when you leave today to find someone that's real important to you and text them 143. And make them respond to you and go, "What in the world are you talking about?" And just telling you, I love you. Just telling you, I love you. Every day he says you need to tell children that they are unique, that they are special, and they are just made the way they are. As adults, that's really hard to listen to. Who here, when someone comes up to you and says, "I am so grateful for you," you go, "Oh, thank you"? No, we deflect. "Oh, that was just so-and-so else," or "that was just this time," or pretend like you don't even hear them. Yeah, as adults, we don't take that very well. And what he's saying is all of us need to realize how wonderfully special we are. Feelings are memorable, and they are always with us, and that was the one thing that Fred Rogers really went into. What do you do when you're feeling? Especially, what do you do when you're feeling mad? Who was taught here it wasn't okay to be mad? Yeah. And a lot of times we grow up in families where mad isn't there. It's great, and anger's not there. It goes to rage immediately. So when you are raised in a family where rage is the norm of this feeling, you try to stuff it down every which way you can. The difference between being mad and being rageful is when you're mad, you're like, "Ugh!" When you're rageful, you just hit. You don't think, your mind's gone, you hit, you kick, you get aggressive. I'm going to tell this story anyway. My grandkids aren't here, and I'm going to share it anyway. So we're on a cruise to Alaska. You would think they could be happy on a cruise to Alaska. And I said it was so nice of your mother to buy us all bingo cards. You would think that would be a safe topic, right? Oh, no, it wasn't. By the end of it, which was like 15 seconds later, one of them had said she just wanted the money from bingo so she could buy this thing she didn't take care of, which made the other one kick the first one in the shin. And I'm like, you're on a cruise in Alaska and you're kicking each other? But that's what feelings can do. And yeah, it's easy to tell it on somebody else, but come on, we've all been there. That gut reaction that makes you so angry you just can't control it. And so Mr. Rogers would try to talk about, you need to, when you get so angry, just say, stop, I can do this. And stop before you go ahead. Now, Mr. Rogers had a lot of people that came on his show, and a lot of people that were part of his show. And he had an Officer Clemmons, and you are right, Officer Clemmons was black, and this was huge. Officer Clemmons was also gay. And Officer Clemmons had gone to a gay nightclub, and it had gotten back, and the people people that paid for the commercials, and they said, if you don't get rid of Officer Clemmons, then we're not going to support you anymore. And Fred Rogers didn't say anything, but he went and talked to Officer Clemmons, and he said, you really can't go to these nightclubs anymore. So Officer Clemmons, on his own accord, decided to go get married. Yeah, we know how that turned out. 6 months later, they weren't still married. But this was really huge in the early 1970s for Officer Clemmons. First of all, he was an amazing singer. And that's how he wanted to be known, not that he was a gay black man. And so this was also at the time where blacks and whites weren't supposed to be swimming in the same swimming pools together. And so Fred Rogers gets a wading pool, pulls up his pants to his knees, invites Officer Clemmons over to roll his up. I would think post carriers have tired feet after they've walked around all day. They both put their feet together in the pool. Let me hear it. Shocking. And this was 2 years after Officer Clemmons in his real life had gone into this gay bar. At that point, Fred Rogers looked him straight in the eye, which he'd been doing all the other times, and said, I love you exactly as you are. Now, that's not the first time he had said it. He'd said it over 2 years. That was the first time Officer Clemmons heard it. Now, in this interview, he is telling this 25 years later, and he cannot tell it without tears in his voice, because he finally heard that he was loved for being a singer and a gay black man, just the way he was. Have you ever experienced someone coming and telling you they love you with all of your warts on? They say that's the sign of a really good friend. And that's what God tells us all the time, that you are loved just the way you are, because God made you just the way you are. So the neighborhood, Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, had people like this in it. Scared people, frightened people, diverse people. People with anxiety, people that were vulnerable, people that were grieving, people that were dealing with the effects of having someone assassinated, people that were slow movers, people that were unique, people that were mad. They even had grown-ups in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood and children. They had conflicted people, divorced people, dying people, lost people, struggling people, fake people, people wondering if they were a mistake. They had embarrassed people, male and female, and non-gendered people, black and white, Hispanic, all kinds of people of the world. Gay people, straight people, bi people, LGBTQ plus people, entitled people, blaming people, evil people. And they were all loved just the way they are. Now, people came back to Mr. Rogers and they said, "You are the one responsible for all of these millennials that are entitled." Isn't that nice to blame one person for all of that? And he said, "No, I didn't tell them. I never told them that they deserved anything." He said, "That's the theology of glory. That there are some churches that say that. You deserve this. You worked hard, you deserve this. You want this, just pray for it and you'll get this." He said, "I never said that." He said, "There are going to be hard times in your lives. There's going to be disappointments in your lives. I have taught people that that's part of life, that there's conflict, that you have to deal with it. But what I've also told them is even when you fall down and you get embarrassed and you do the worst thing in the world, you are still loved." He said, "That's theology of cross. That's not theology of glory." You see, Mr. Rogers taught straight from the Bible. He used different words, but the story was the same. You were wonderful, you were precious, and you are loved. And all God's people say, amen.